This is the MS St. Louis. It's an ocean liner in its home port of Hamburg, Germany. And this is the captain, Gustav Schröder. And these are passengers getting on that ship on May 13th, 1939. And here are those passengers a few weeks later, awaiting their fate. There are about 900 of them. They are Jewish refugees escaping the Nazi regime in Germany. They're hoping to get to Cuba, and while in Cuba, they'll await their turn to then find refuge in the United States. It's 1939. Jews had already been through quite a bit. Kristallnacht had happened about 6 months earlier, when their synagogues were burned, when they were openly murdered, when their cemeteries were vandalized, when their homes and businesses were destroyed, and when they were arrested, and tens of thousands of them were rounded up and sent to the concentration camps that had already been built throughout Germany. But in 1939, they did still stand a chance to escape. They were allowed out of the concentration camps on the terms that they get out of Germany and never come back. And this was all part of the Nazis' master propaganda plan, because they knew that other nations would be unwilling to accept them, and that they would be able to exploit that by saying, see, you don't want them either, and this justifies our anti-Jewish goals and policies. So many of the passengers on that ship in the summer of 1939 had already been in the concentration camps. They had already lost everything. Some of them had already lost everyone. So they were fearful, but they were hopeful that they would have a chance to escape with their life. And so even though a Nazi flag flew high above that ship, they boarded and they started to make their journey to Cuba. A few weeks later, they get there. They had really gone through a lot in order to get the resources to even get themselves on the St. Louis. They had already been banned from most kinds of employment in Germany. They had lost everything, resources were scarce. The fees for the voyage were very expensive. They had to purchase very expensive landing permits to allow them to disembark in Cuba. Some families had to pool together the remaining resources they had and decide to just put one family member on that boat in hopes that just one could survive. But unfortunately, when they got to Cuba, the toxic mindset that had taken over Germany had taken over many other places of the world too. 9 days before they set sail, it turned out that those expensive landing permits that they had purchased had been nullified by a decree that was recently issued unbeknownst to them. The people in Cuba also bought into some pretty common fears about foreigners. It was propaganda that allowed them to make that mistake. Agents from the propaganda ministry within Nazi Germany had actually spent some time in Cuba stirring up such feelings, telling the Cubans that the Jews were undesirable, that they were criminals. Fearful groups within Cuba spread publications, organized demonstrations to spread the idea that they were communist and that they were just going to steal Cubans' jobs. So now, finding out that these landing permits were no good, when they arrived in Havana on May 27th, only 22 passengers were allowed off of that ship because they had already had official US visas. The rest were not allowed to get off board. One man attempted to slit his wrist and jump overboard in a suicide attempt. And so suicide patrols were set up on the ship. Captain Schroeder was terrified at what could ensue at these refugees taking their own lives, having come so far, only now to be turned away. So Schroeder is desperate. He cannot take these people back to Germany. It is already well known what their fate will be. And so he sails the ship around for a couple of days while outside organizations are furiously trying to get negotiations in place to allow them into Cuba, but they are unsuccessful. And so seeing the lights shining from Miami, just 90 miles north, he decides that he's going to take the ship to America. Certainly, America is going to let these people in. But that's not going to be the case. Immigration laws at this time in America were some of the most discriminatory in our nation's history. They had been passed in the 1920s. They reflected the national mood at the time. A very few amount of foreigners were allowed in, and they made the laws based on census reports that would favor white Europeans from the North and the West. Anyone Asian had long been banned from being legally allowed to immigrate into the United States. And even though these laws were quite outdated by 1939, the mindset of the people when they were put in place reflected that national mood. Again, furiously they are trying to get negotiations in place to let these folks in. And they were turned away. FDR could have issued an executive order, but he knew the anti-foreigner mood of the time. He would soon be seeking a third term as president, and he knew that this would be political assassination for him. And so he did nothing. Instead, a U.S. Coast Guard ship, while an airplane flew overhead, followed them out to prevent Schroeder from landing. But Schroeder wasn't just any regular guy. He was a compassionate man. He refused to take that ship back to Germany, where those people would certainly die. And so he stalled going back to Europe. There would only be enough food and water for a few more weeks. And he had to head back there. Somebody other than Germany had to take them. So outside groups are working to get these negotiations in place, and miraculously they are able to do so. Great Britain agrees to take 288, France 224, Belgium 214, the Netherlands will take 181. All but one of those 288 in Great Britain survived World War II. But unfortunately, as you know, the Nazis did invade Western Europe shortly after their return, and just under half of the Jews that were on the St. Louis in 1939 ended up being murdered in concentration camps. And I'm reminded of this story today because we know that after World War II, when millions had perished, it left in its wake 40 million that had been displaced, that were seeking refuge because everything had been destroyed. It was the worst refugee crisis that the world had seen up until that time. But as I stand up here today, we have surpassed it. We are now living in the worst refugee crisis of all time. There are 65 million people on our earth right now that have been displaced, that, like the passengers on the St. Louis, had nowhere to go, and only stand the hope that we today remember our history that we all share, that we remember the humanity that we all share, and that we learn from it. Because, like it or not, we are all in this together. We always have been, we always will be. We cannot separate ourselves from what happened to the people on this ship in 1939, when we clearly have not corrected the mistakes made in history. And we inherit those mistakes. And it is our job to correct them. So where did we go wrong? The quota system that was in place in the 1920s had no business being in place in a world that was now being destroyed by war. But the American people didn't favor another system. When asked in a Fortune poll if we should be letting these Jewish refugees in, the majority of Americans said no. Because they bought into the same fear that was elsewhere, that the Jewish people were criminals, that they would be a national security threat, and that they would take American jobs. The ironic part about what we tell ourselves that these people are is that it's the very thing that they are actually fleeing. These laws only became more strict as time went on. In 1941, they enacted a part of an old law that was still in place that said nobody could any longer come from Germany that still had ancestors living in Germany. They might be a Nazi. They might be here to spy. And these are the people that are trying to escape the Nazis. Today we tell ourselves that refugees are terrorists. They are the ones escaping the terrorist. Unbeknownst to a lot of Americans, one of these people in 41 that got turned away was Otto Frank, who was desperately trying to get his daughters out of Germany. In 2007, we discovered over 80 pages of paperwork where he was furiously trying to apply for visas and otherwise to get those girls out of there. Anne Frank today would be in her late 70s, but instead, she too, like so many others that could not get out, died as a teenager in a concentration camp. Not everybody was on the wrong side of history. In 1939, that summer when the St. Louis passengers awaited their fate, both Democrats and Republicans came together and sponsored in both houses bipartisan legislation that would allow Jewish children to come in, because it was well known and well published what was happening to Jews in Germany. We knew. Certainly Jewish children can't compete for American jobs, and certainly Jewish children aren't Nazi spies, so we could let them in, right? The bill proposed that we let 10,000 of them in 1939, another 10,000 in 1940. And that bill died in committee. And we can't blame our politicians, because this reflected what the American people believed. And 61% in a poll said no to the children. And this sounds terrible to us. How could they have been so inhumane? How could they have done this? But what they're doing is something that's very easy to do and something that we're doing today. And that is that we are letting fear lie to us, and we are believing those lies. Fearing outsiders is something that we can't entirely help. It is something that's built into our evolutionary biology to see foreigners as a threat, because many thousands of years ago that could have been the case. You see a marauding army off on the hillside. Yes, you want to go into fight or flight mode. But that fear does something to us that we need to be very conscious of. Number one, we exaggerate fear of outsiders when we perceive there to be a threat. And because fear is an emotion and it's not based on rationality, we don't make rational choices. And we tend to hear a story of, say, a refugee being a terrorist, and we allow that then to become stickier in our minds than facts. Because the fact is that refugees are less likely to commit crimes than Americans. But that's not what we think. And soon that fear leads to dehumanization. Researchers recently did a study where they asked white Americans to pull this dot over on the bar of to what extent the following humans were human. And although many very quickly were able to slide the bar all the way over, because we are all human and we are all the same, it probably won't surprise you that many Americans did sit there and pull the bar differently depending on who they were talking about. And because when we hear these stories over and over and we are letting fear lie to us, we are slowly dehumanizing the people that we are hearing these stories about. And it probably won't surprise you who we said were less than human. It was the Arabs, it was the Muslims, it was the people that we are hearing all the time that we should not help, that we should be afraid of. We are doing what people did in 1939. Next thing you know, we're going to have to answer to future generations why we find this to be acceptable. We are going to have to answer to this. And when future generations look at the primary sources of what we had available to us at this time, they're going to look at the evidence and they're going to say, they knew. Just like in '39, widely publicized. They knew. Another myth that we believe about refugees is that they want to leave their countries. They don't. We forget what they go through to get out. We forget how badly they hope to return someday. They leave on foot. They hop on the top of moving trains. They hide in the back of trucks. They get on dangerous little rafts and paddle themselves to safety. What kind of war and persecution would make somebody go to such great lengths to cross a border? And if we share our humanity and we share our history, then we need to go back further than 1939 and ask ourselves to critically think about these borders in the first place. Governments around the world right now are spending billions and billions of dollars building walls and barbed wire fences to protect these imaginary lines on a map, but not solving the actual humanitarian crisis. That is one of the biggest problems of our time. So we need to at least stop and ask, and at least wonder, at what point in history did the lines that are currently on our world map end up there? Why? What were the consequences of that? Who benefited? Who didn't? Is any of the war and persecution that people are fleeing today, is any of this related somehow to how these borders were drawn when they were drawn? If 97% of citizenship is inherited, and if that citizenship means that you could live or die, should we begin to question our conception of citizenship? Our history is global. Our humanity is global. We need to at least start asking these questions. I have a confession. It is a little bit easier for me to stand up here today and remind you of the humanity of refugees because I had the opportunity to work with them before becoming a public school teacher. And I consider myself quite privileged to have been able to make these friendships, to be able to teach their children. And it got me thinking a lot about what we expect from children, what we teach children. We know that children learn through modeling, and we expect them at a very young age to be nice, be fair, share, say you're sorry. And I just can't help but wonder where we would be in our shared history, where we would be in our shared humanity, if we simply practiced what we preached, if we simply did what we are asking small children to do. How would that change humanity? How would that change history, our story? How would that change us?